The business challenge that I had when I joined in 2014 was pretty simple. We had about 10 different companies in the UK, all of which were pretty good individually, and which, if you added them up together, made this, this really quite large 2,500 people business. But they saw themselves very much as 10 individual companies. And the challenge for me as the head of McCann World Group, which is all the companies, was to try and bring them together so that the sum of the parts added up to more than the individual totals. And that was very difficult because there were a whole series of historic and kind of craft differences between them, and long memories of slights and injustices, and sense of inferiority, superiority, all of which made the collaboration process much more difficult. So we needed something that was a breakthrough, and that was how we found ourselves at the very beginning of 2016 embarking on what was really quite a big leap into the unknown. If you look back on it now, nearly 7 years in fact, after we first started working together, it's the business has not only kind of grown significantly. I mean, the UK business is probably 50% bigger than it was then in 2016, and much more effective, much more productive, much more profitable. But the sort of sense that the people have of being part of this overall identity of World Group, as opposed to simply a McCann office here or an MRM office there, is palpable. And that was the thing that I thought could transform us, and that I think is the thing that has transformed us. And the prototype that the model that's been developed in the UK, is now seen as a very effective one all around the McCann world. So it's actually, to be fair, it's succeeded far better than I could possibly, as we sat in that circle back in January in 2016, possibly have imagined. Yeah, I mean, I think it's two or three sort of really significant things, and the first is that in effect we make the world as opposed to the world making us. Once you start seeing yourself as a projector, as opposed to a camera, the sense that you can't always affect events, but you can absolutely affect your response to those events and the meaning you put upon those events. And that ultimately gives the individual a huge amount of power, because you're not shaped by what is happening, you're shaped by how you react to and interpret what's happening. And that that suddenly frees you up from kind of the tyranny of cause and effect. So that's the first sort of massive thing. The second thing, I think, is this sort of sense of the universal mind and the kind of the sort of the benevolent intelligence that sort of fills the universe, and the sort of the metaphor of having an aperture which is either more open or more closed to that kind of benevolent universal intelligence is very helpful, because the tendency always, when things are difficult, you're under pressure of any sort, is to kind of is to literally tense up, close up, and shut the world out and try and solve it by yourself. And for me, as an individual who's always been comparatively self-reliant, that is kind of absolutely hardwired. So the idea that you could treat yourself not as a kind of as a sort of highly memoried and sort of reasoned up laptop, but as more of a dumb terminal, which kind of lets the universal intelligence and benevolence in, was fantastically helpful for me, because again, it allowed me to let go of, that sort of pressure to be the person who made all the decisions, and to go with the flow more, and to allow things to happen more. And that in turn, made life not only more enjoyable, but also, I think probably made a lot of the decisions I made probably better than they would have been otherwise. And then the third big thing for me is, about thought and how we attach, meaning to things. And again, if you're kind of a sort of thoughtful, intelligent person, you tend to, and I do this, I tend to overthink everything, and I tend to kind of attach way too much meaning as to why something happened and why didn't I do that, and and that becomes very destructive. And I think the sense of being able to observe something and not attach meaning to it, not therefore be kind of tyrannized by it as a sort of an underlier or kind of prover of existing patterns of some sort, is very, very helpful, because it stops me from being distracted, and it allows me to stay in the moment much more, rather than being dragged into recrimination or regret or any of those other sort of slightly kind of corrosive emotions. So those, there are lots of other things, but as an individual, those are the three big things that I've kind of taken out of it. I think the sort of the big difference is that, Quality of Mind, the potential is so big, but it's also, it's not like a craft training course, or a kind of very specific behavioral sort of technique, kind of training. It is about seeing the world in a different way, and seeing how you act in it in a different way, and therefore, but the massive benefit of that is that if you do it, if you commit to it, and it works for an individual or a group, and generally it tends to work, in my experience, for the great majority of a group, and when it works for an individual, it works very powerfully indeed, then it becomes not simply something that you do for 3-4 days and you get a benefit from for the next sort of few months, and then there's a half-life that decays quite fast. It becomes an organic thing that becomes a part of the experience of all those individuals, but it also becomes a part of the discourse that they have between them, and the thing that they share in common, and it becomes a self-perpetuating thing. And for the people who have been in that leadership group who've been most affected by it, it's been a kind of continual growth, as opposed to something which had an effect and then was kind of gently forgotten. It will be with them. It'll certainly be with me for hopefully as long as I'm around, and I think for some of those others in that group it will be as well. I think one of the sort of the most powerful and interesting things which I see is the sort of sense of not needing to try and anticipate and sort of almost pre-influence events in quite the way that I did. And obviously, if you're kind of trying to sort of shape the world almost in advance as you go, it's very hard work. And that, that generally tends to come because you're seeing the world very mechanistically, and you're seeing it very much from your own point of view. Once you have a greater sense of, the sort of the sense of the universal intelligence, and B, the idea that sort of what's happening is kind of as much what you're making it as opposed to what is actually happening, then you're able to react much more relaxedly in the moment to events, and that is both more effective, but it's also much less tiring. And the number of conversations that I've had in the last few years where, previously I would have started to panic very early on about where is this conversation going? Oh, I've got to head this off. Is this going to be a disaster? And I've kind of let it unfold and develop. And in the moment, allowed my quality of mind to stay high and my aperture to remain open, and then found a way of changing the course of the conversation in a way that felt productive and good. The sense that it certainly has given me that you're much more in control of your world is a massive empowerment. And that, so particularly in times of stress and sort of fear, that's very, very useful. But also this sense that, you're not alone, that there is a sort of not only a universal intelligence, but also on a micro scale, if you open yourself up more to the people around you, you'll channel their sort of goodwill and intelligence and sort of talent as well. That I think is hugely beneficial on a sort of that applies to families, friendship groups, as well as businesses, and a sense of not needing to kind of analyze everything. We live in a very information rich and deductive sort of society, and if you allow yourself to be more intuitive and more impressionistic in the way that you react and take decisions, that can be fantastically liberating as well, again, in personal relationships as well as professional ones. In terms of justifying it originally was to say, it's really hard for us as a business, even a good business, to say we're going to hire people who are significantly better than any of our employees, and it's very hard to give them knowledge that is superior to any of our competitors. So we've got to focus on how they are in themselves at any given moment. And that we didn't think of it then, I think, as a whole person approach, because that phrase was probably not sort of in sort of currency, but actually it was a whole person approach. Generally, people who are feeling safe, people who are feeling confident, people who are feeling loved, have better ideas and interact better with the people around them than people who are feeling insecure, unsafe, and kind of not appreciated. So it's, I think it's the two things are incredibly closely interwoven, because business in almost every sense now is a highly people-orientated activity, and therefore people who are feeling better about themselves in the world are better at it. The fact is that if you're coming to work with a group of people who clearly enjoy working with each other and are a kind of highly, an elite in the good sense, highly productive, highly kind of effective team, that I think is massively seductive to talent, both as an acquisition thing, but also as a kind of retention mechanism. And and the fact is that it used to be possible, I think, to sort of say, well, unashamedly, we're going to run quite a brutal sweatshop, but you will produce some good work. And I think the sense in the last half decade is that that's a very hard thing to run for a long time. You can maybe do a couple of years of that, but it takes its toll. And if you want to kind of create more corporate sort of continuity and a better sort of sense of kind of esprit de corps over a long period of time, you have to find a way of being, elite and effective, productive, which is not so bruising to the people engaged in it. And I think the quality of mind approach is a much lighter touch. It's a much more natural way of doing that than simply relying on willpower alone. I wish I'd taken it 10 years earlier rather than, I'm very glad I took it now, but I wish I'd done it 10 years earlier, because it would have been, made for a much more effective previous decade. And I think, the sort of, we work in a very, we live in a very scientific and mechanistic way of thinking about the world. And it's fundamentally, our kind of understanding of business is fundamentally based on technique. Better technique equals better results. And the idea that you can do something so basic as to change, the way that you feel about the world and the way you think and the way you make decisions at a kind of precognitive level almost, is a tough one to grasp. The fact is that that's why it's so powerful, because it's at a level which is way deeper than most of those technique things. But because we think about the world in that way, it's difficult to kind of escape from that when you're contemplating spending sort of precious time and precious money with people whose opinions you care about as a leader. To do that, but all I can say is that we're in a period of sort of where risks are becoming, I think, more essential. Taking risks is not really a luxury anymore. It's I think taking productive, calculated, thoughtful risks is necessary to make businesses and make individuals better and more productive, and this is a very good risk in my view. But you have probably, I think, 220 working days in a year, so 3 is kind of 1.5% of them. And frankly, if you can give up 1.5% to get an extra 15, that's pretty good. It's one of those things where, it's if you start thinking about it on a society-wide level, then it becomes extraordinarily powerful. We've sort of, I've viewed it as a sort of individual and kind of business kind of advantage. But if you thought about it being sort of mass, taken up in a mass way, then it becomes, enormously transformative on a global level. I think from a business, telling other people in business about it, we're in a world of incredible competition, of enormous, information kind of overload, and getting better information and getting better sort of resources is incredibly difficult. And the quality of mind has the sort of key to making the people you're already working with so much more, and therefore the organization so much more. And that's why it's like the hydrofoil on the boat. It creates this sort of extraordinary uplift in sort of performance with comparatively little sort of effort. Once you get past the point about believing the hydrofoil won't work, if you can believe in hydrofoils, then you can believe in quality of mind.